This is Mark J. Boone, Assistant Professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. This is a video abstract from my article, Augustine and William James on the Rationality of Faith, an article published in the Haythrop Journal in the year 2019. Augustine and William James are among the greatest defenders of religious faith in the history of thought. Their arguments on behalf of faith mark important connections between theology and philosophy. Augustine argues that religious faith is trust, and that trust is a normal and necessary way of believing, foundational to much of our rational belief, foundational to family and social life. It's also the proper way for us to get to the truth when we lack first-hand knowledge. Beginning with faith, we then work towards knowledge by means of philosophical contemplation, in the manner of the Neoplatonists whom Augustine admires and frequently draws from. William James, in his essay, The Will to Believe, makes two pragmatic arguments for the rationality of faith. We do not know, at least not yet, whether God exists, but faith meets a well-established criterion for rational decision-making. It is, for many of us, a highly consequential choice we must make between multiple possibilities which are open to us. It's a choice between the risk of believing something false and the risk of not believing something true. And in the absence of very clear evidence, we can decide for ourselves which risk we prefer. We may be able to experience God in the future and thereby gain knowledge, but even this may be contingent on our willingness to believe. Thus, says James. Now, in this article, I don't try to break any new ground on Augustine or James or directly confront any scholarly debates on their text. I just compare and contrast their religious epistemologies and take a brief look at the possibility of future synthesis. This is something that leads to these observations. Faith in James and Augustine is understood as rational and as practical and as something which is to be distinguished from knowledge, though I ought to mention that Augustine, in some of his later writing, does suggest that knowledge by faith is a reasonable, everyday description of knowledge. Usually, however, he distinguishes knowledge from faith while emphasizing the rationality of faith. So knowledge is rational and practical and precedes knowledge, but there are some differences. In Augustine, the object of faith is Christian testimony. He's an Orthodox Christian. Faith is in testimony from Christ, from Scripture, and from Church. James is defending the rationality of whatever religious commitment may be of interest to us. And as far as I can tell, he himself is not an Orthodox Christian. A difference also is found in their, not just the object of testimony, but in their understanding of where knowledge comes from. James is defending a version of empiricism and a version of pragmatism. Augustine thinks the eventual acquisition of knowledge relies mainly on philosophical contemplation, again resembling the Neoplatonists. James thinks knowledge may eventually come from future experience. So Augustine, in other words, is a Christian somewhat under the influence of Neoplatonist rationalism. James is an empiricist and a pragmatist. Now, these differences are somewhat significant, but may be a little less significant than they may first appear, as I show towards the end of the article. I note that Augustine himself has an empiricist streak, or an empiricist aspect to his epistemology. I go over that in a few of his texts. And I point out how there's one thinker in particular who is maybe the most influential Augustinian of his century, if not his era, who happens to come to one of the same observations as James. The observation is that the idea that God is a person has relevance for the possibility of the verification of religious knowledge. Religious belief might be verified in future experience, but if God is a person, that means that our belief in God will not be verified quite the same way a geologist would verify knowledge of rocks. Our belief in God will be verified in ways constrained somewhat by the fact that God is a person, by the fact that God as a person is not going to provide all the evidence independently of our willingness to believe. Some evidence may come as a result of our relationship with God, which may require us to be willing to, as James says, meet the hypothesis halfway, which may require us to be willing to believe in God prior to the full evidence. This thinker in particular I'm thinking of, the Christian Orthodox Augustinian, who arrives at one of the same observations in religious epistemology that is so interesting that James arrives at. This thinker does think that God has given us some pretty good evidence for his existence. He is known as a Christian apologist, but he also observes that the confirmation of religious belief in future religious experience is not to be understood, although it is an empirical matter, not to be understood in quite the same way as we would understand, say, geology or most of the other sciences. It is going to be a confirmation of religious truth built off of our relationship with God and our willingness to trust and obey. If you don't already know whom I'm talking about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis integrates a fair amount of Augustine, and surprise, at least one interesting observation from William James in this very book. The article should be of interest to anyone with a particular fancy for religious epistemology, James or Augustine, or maybe even Lewis, and it should be available from any nearby university library that has access to the Haythorpe Journal. If and when copyright issues allow, I hope to make it available on my academia.edu profile and philpapers.org. Thanks for watching.